Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. You guys know that Katie and I love parenting. We love our kids to bits. We love the process of raising up our children. I love being a dad, and I know that Katie loves being a mom. But parenting is one of those things, kind of, when you think about it, really, it's kind of futile. There's definitely a futility about parenting, or I guess it's futile in a sense. I don't want anybody to despair about raising children. But what I mean is that as parents, we can lovingly enforce things. We can have rules. We can set examples for our kids by the way we live our own lives. But at the end of the day, we can't actually reach into our children's hearts and calibrate them the way we want to. We can influence our kids. We can teach them. We should teach them. But obviously, we can't just say the word and make them into the people that we want them to be. There's no dial to turn. There's no button to push. So, for example, if I want Dottie to be a considerate, loving person, I can make rules to punish inconsiderate behavior. I can try to incentivize loving behavior. I can try to be considerate and loving myself so that maybe my example will inspire her. But I can't just make it happen. Addressing the behavior is one thing. Addressing the heart is something totally different. The problem of the human heart is at the center of the whole Christian story. It's on every page of the Old Testament. It's on every page of the New Testament. So there's a whole lot that could be said on that theme of the human heart. I'll have to content myself just with the readings we have in the lectionary this morning. And actually, let's take a look at those readings together. You should have them in your handout, of course. You may have already noticed this, but if you look closely at our first three readings, so I'm talking about our Old Testament reading from Deuteronomy, Psalm 112, and our epistle reading from 2 Corinthians, if you look at all three of those, you'll notice some pretty significant through lines. There's a golden thread here. The lectionary makers are not dummies. They put things together very thoughtfully. What each of these three readings seems to kind of orbit around, at least in part, is generosity, giving, open-handedness. And there's definitely a financial edge to each of these readings. There's no getting around the financial part of these readings. But really, what we see in each one is that it's more than just about the money. The heart is at the heart of it. Now, let me set up a little bit of context for us with this Deuteronomy passage. That's a good place for us to start. What's going on in Deuteronomy is that Moses is laying out God's law. He's explaining it for the generation of Israelites who are about to go into the promised land. So this is right after that 40-year wilderness wandering, which took place after the Exodus from Egypt. The people of Israel are about to go into the promised land, and Moses is explaining what he had been told by God at Mount Sinai. And where we pick up in chapter 15, Moses has just finished explaining a particular statute of God's law. And that is that at the end of every 7 years, every creditor is supposed to release the debt that's owed to them, which is kind of an amazing thing when we think about it from today's standards. That never happens. And now in the passage that we read, Moses goes on to prescribe generosity across the board for everyone. If there's a poor person among the people of God, they are to lend to them without any reservation at all. And even if that 7th year of releasing debts is coming up quickly, Even if that's the case, they should still lend to whoever needs it, even if there's little or even no hope at all of getting back what they gave. It shouldn't change anything. God's people are to be marked by generosity, and not just generosity in action, but generosity in heart. What Moses lays out for the Israelites is not just certain behaviors. He's insisting on an internal disposition. He's talking about the heart when he says, "You shall give to your neighbor freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him." Following God's commandments is a full-bodied exercise. God's claim on us is total. What our hands are doing is supposed to link up with what's happening inside of our hearts. Because our hearts, as well as our hands, belong to God. Now, that same point that Moses makes in Deuteronomy is expressed poetically in Psalm 112. Now, this whole psalm that we read today is a description of, quote, "they who fear the Lord and have great delight in his commandments." That's right there at the top in verse 1. This whole thing is just describing figuratively and with great imagery those who fear God. Now take a look at verse 5. "It is good for them," the psalmist says, "to be generous in lending and to manage their affairs with justice." And then again in verse 9, "They have given freely to the poor, and their righteousness stands fast forever." They have given freely. That's a window into the heart, isn't it? The one who fears the Lord is generous, open-handed, and their actions spring out of a God-oriented, God-captivated heart. Now let's fast forward a little bit in salvation history. Let's jump forward. Jesus has come, he has died, he's risen from the dead, he has ascended into heaven, and now churches have sprung up throughout the Roman Empire. And a lot of that is in large part thanks to St. Paul's ministry. Paul, of course, who was the apostle to the Gentiles. And now Paul is dealing with various issues in these churches. One of the churches that he writes to is the church in Corinth. And now Paul is dealing with something very particular with them. One of his purposes in writing to the Corinthians, in what we call 2 Corinthians, is dealing with this issue of a money collection that he's taking up. Paul is trying to raise finances among a bunch of the Gentile churches to then take back to the Jewish Christians who are living in Judea, because there's this big famine that's happening at that time, and they really need the help. So Paul is trying to raise this money to send back to those hurting Christians as a show of unity with them. Now, at the beginning of our passage that we read in 2 Corinthians, Paul he's kind of bragging on some of the churches in Macedonia. And really, of course, he's bragging on God working through these churches, because apparently these churches in Macedonia have really ponied up big time for this collection fund that Paul's taking up. And Paul says that they did this, they gave this so freely out of their own free will. Paul says that they were begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. They were dying to get in on this ministry. These Macedonians were incredibly generous. They didn't have much, but as Paul says, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of liberality on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, Paul says, and beyond their means. Clearly, these Macedonian Christians did not give begrudgingly. These are folks whose hearts were totally and completely transformed by the gospel of Jesus. And Paul desires that same transformation for the Corinthians. Yes, he wants them to contribute, but he wants it to spring out of transformed hearts, hearts that have truly absorbed the gospel story. So he doesn't command them. He doesn't force them to make any contribution. And I guess if his goal is transformation of heart, then maybe commanding wouldn't do any good anyways. It's like me commanding that Dottie be a considerate, loving person. I can command the behavior, but I can't command the heart. So Paul doesn't command the contribution. He allows them to come around to it on their own. All that he does, all that Paul does, is set before them, again, the gospel story. And he presents it to them in a simplified, beautiful way. He says this, "You know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." Paul is using a financial metaphor here. Christ, in his great humility, emptied himself. He gave himself entirely. He became poor, so to speak, and also literally, because he lived a very humble lifestyle as an itinerant teacher. But he did all this. He became poor, most chiefly on the cross, so that we might be filled with the riches of God's grace. That's what Paul is putting before the Corinthians. That's what will transform their hearts so that they might give themselves for others freely and joyfully, like the Macedonians, like Jesus. When that gospel story, that basic gospel story, when it's embedded in someone, the result is necessarily transformation, continual transformation, lifelong transformation. The gospel does what no other human can do for us. It actually reaches into our hearts and changes us. It takes time, for sure. It takes continual reminding and learning and growing, but it does change us if we let it. The gospel story, when we've accepted it and marinated in it and let it diffuse into our attitudes and relationships and every other aspect of our lives, it changes us into the image of Jesus. And we start to give of ourselves freely, gladly, like Jesus. Now, before I said that parenting is futile, just in a certain sense. And that's an important asterisk, because there is a much more important sense in which parenting is definitely not futile. So don't worry. Parenting is good and holy. I may not be able to reach into my children's hearts and transform them myself, but I can introduce them to somebody who can. I can tell them the gospel story over and over and over, so that maybe it might soak into their whole being. And I want to do that, not just for my kids, but for myself and for all of us. I know I need to hear the gospel story every day. When I ask myself how I'm doing at looking like Jesus, it's abundantly clear to me that I have major work to do. There's a lot of transformation that still needs to happen in here so that I can give of myself more freely, like Jesus. So let's spend more time with the gospel story in our homes, with our families, with ourselves. Let's give ourselves to the one who gave himself wholly for us, the one who reaches into our hearts and makes us totally and completely new. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.